Hello friends, welcome to another edition of Conversations at Matrix Mag. Today, for this conversation, we have with us Adam Weinstein, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, New York. He has also served as a Marine in Afghanistan with the US forces and by implication has a good overview of the situation in the entire region. So he's been visiting Pakistan, and that's why we thought we should have his views as well as to what is happening in the region in his view, from his vintage point of view. Welcome Adam to Matrix Mag, and let's start with the Pakistan-US relationship. This has been very checkered with several spikes, a lot of tensions every now and then. Where is it now headed, particularly after former Prime Minister Imran Khan was voted out, and also to the context of the emerging growing tensions in the region following the Ukraine war?
Well, look, there's more engagement between the new government and the Biden administration, but I don't think that Washington really has a Pakistan policy right now. I think the relationship is sort of just hobbling along and it has no clear direction. Well, I do think folks in Washington are irked by countries that haven't been vocal in criticism of Russia. So far as the China-US competition goes, in some cases, the United States has pushed some countries to take clear sides. In the case of Pakistan, I don't think Washington would do this, but it does put Pakistan in a bit of a difficult situation as it tries to have oftentimes equidistant relations between both of them.
It is certainly not an easy situation for smaller countries when it comes to taking sort of sides with this country or that country. Now, how tough does it become for a smaller country like Pakistan to navigate the consequences of the geopolitical contest between the US on the one side and China and Russia on the other?
I think it can be, because Pakistan has to take the help it can get, and oftentimes that help is more expedient from China, even though Pakistan might want to have closer relations with Washington at the same time. So really puts Pakistan in a situation where it has to make short-term decisions that often at least appear to align it closer with China, while still wanting to balance the relationship between the United States and China. And that's a really difficult tightrope to walk.
Let's talk a bit about Afghanistan. You have served there. You are still very much engaged intellectually, researching and looking at developments in Afghanistan. Now, do you think that the US has now decided to sort of disengage from that country now that it fought for 20 years there and it had to sort of leave abruptly in August 2021? Does it have any plans to really engage Afghanistan to help this country overcome its multiple crises, including the economic crisis that Afghanistan's Taliban regime is facing?
Well, look, I really do think that Washington was moving towards repatriating at least the 3.5 billion of the frozen foreign exchange reserves that Biden had set aside for the Afghans. Keep in mind that U.S. plaintiffs or 9/11 families are fighting over the other half. And they may prevail and they may not. But I think that the Biden administration was moving towards sending back a large amount of that money to Afghanistan, but the fact that the Taliban pulled girls out of school made that politically difficult. And there's other issues at play too, including sanctions, including money laundering issues, including the capacity of Afghanistan's central bank itself. I think there's an intent to repatriate that money. I think what we have to remember is that's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea that's going to solve everything. If we lifted the sanctions today, and I think we should, because I don't think they're serving their intended purpose, but if we lifted the sanctions today and we no longer or we no longer held the reserves, we'd still be left with a country that's landlocked and doesn't have a significant economy and is not an attractive place for investment. Now, when I say lifting the sanctions, I mean the broad sweeping sanctions. It might make sense to keep individual sanctions on individual Taliban figures. But so far as the way the sanctions work now, what they were essentially intended for the Taliban as it was an insurgency, not for the Taliban as the de facto government of Afghanistan. And the effect of these sanctions has been a chilling effect on the country. Now, what the U.S. Treasury Department has done is they've issued general licenses, and you can think of these as exemptions to the sanctions or exceptions to the sanctions. And they've issued several general licenses. I think it might be 7 at this point, basically allowing certain types of transactions to take place. And if you look at it from a technical or legal perspective, these general licenses have really defanged the effect of the sanctions. They allow a lot of transactions to take place in Afghanistan by law, but the issue is that there's a chilling effect of the sanctions because they're still in place. So companies and individuals don't necessarily want to take the risk of, oh, well, look, there's a general license that allows this kind of transaction. I can engage in this kind of trade with Afghanistan because the Treasury Department has issued a general license. Instead, they're more inclined to say, look, the sanctions still exist. Let's not even touch Afghanistan. It's too much of a business risk. There are actions that the United States could take regarding sanctions, regarding the frozen foreign exchange reserves that would improve Afghanistan's economy. There are actions that the U.S. has taken that have improved Afghanistan's, the well-being of Afghans. I think the U.S. has to date donated a significant. I don't have the figures, so I don't want to misquote it, but I think it was $775 million to Afghans. But what I think we need is a more long-term approach that allows Afghanistan to develop its own economy. It can't remain aid dependent indefinitely.
Well, imposing or lifting sanctions at will as a country deems fit obviously doesn't help. Now, do you think this tendency of the United States to every now and then talk of sanctions and impose or subject a country to such punitive measures really help in taking or in resolving the issues, regional issues, bilateral or multilateral issues?
The use of sanctions around the world, granted the UN engages in sanctions, but the US is the leader of implementing sanctions around the world. And I think in some cases they have been overused. Again, Afghanistan's a perfect example of a case in which sanctions have, in my view at this point, absolutely no legitimate use. When you look at the willingness of the Biden administration to engage with Saudi Arabia due to realpolitik, concerns and overlook all the human rights violations of that country, and then you compare that to the complete isolation that Afghanistan finds itself in, granted, largely due to the Taliban's own behavior, and stubbornness and oppression of their own people. But when you compare these two examples, it really, should make you wonder, what is the use of sanctions? Are these sanctions achieving anything, or are they simply punitive?
Adam, there's another question. Could ramping up pressure on China and Russia really not expose the contradictions within the Western alliance? As the US has been urging all the countries to gradually reduce and then eventually cut down their oil and gas imports from Russia, while there are European countries which are heavily dependent on these fossil fuel supplies from Russia, and Nord Stream 1 that connects Russia with Germany has again started pumping gas into Germany and its neighboring countries.
This is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I think speaking generally on this, in some cases, I think smaller countries that are allied with the United States have sort of taken advantage of the US's position. They've basically had their cake and eaten it too. And, they've continued to have relations with, more robust relations with Russia and China, while also being happy to have the US take a hard line. On the other hand, I think a lot of our partners around the world, including in Europe, including in Southeast Asia, are not willing to go, are not willing to completely pick sides or escalate tensions to further with China. And so they want to see U.S. leadership perhaps in certain areas, but they don't want to see a completely antagonistic relationship between Washington and Beijing in which they have to choose a side.
It's quite true, as you say, that challenging a country as big as China could be delusional. Now, keeping that in view, would you say that challenging China would really make any sense geopolitically or economically?
I think there's a consensus, perhaps a risky consensus in Washington, that we absolutely must challenge China in various different areas. And I think it, prevents us from finding off-ramps for cooperation. I think it prevents us from, at least in the United States, dealing with other threats such as a crumbling infrastructure or climate change. But I think, the consensus is what's risky. There might be areas where the United States does need to compete with China or challenge China, but that can't be the defining way that the United States interacts with China. And I think this idea that a country as large as China can simply be contained is a bit delusional. China doesn't need to invade other countries because it will just extend its influence, and then it won't adopt the norms that have been established in the so-called international order. That being said, I do think that's overplayed and overstated. I think the United States itself has frequently thrown out norms and violated the norms of the so-called international order that it claims to uphold. So I don't want to draw false equivalencies between China and the United States in terms of how they view human rights necessarily, but I think we also have to recognize that for most of the world, when they do view the US actions over the last 20 years, they do see significant human rights violations. And I think folks in Washington ought to consider what is the reputational damage of that. I personally think reputation in international relations is overvalued. I don't think reputation matters quite as much as what some political scientists might assume it does. But for a town like Washington that is so obsessed with reputation and credibility, I think we have to look at the ways in which we have soiled our own credibility and reputation, and perhaps focus on that. To the extent that it can be avoided, I don't think it makes sense to challenge China as a core policy position. But that also, requires some agency from China. I mean, China also does at times engage in bullying or coercion itself. So, both Washington and China would have to be willing to engage in a more productive relationship. Unfortunately, what I see happening in both countries, and again, this is a bit outside my field of expertise, but the most antagonistic voices in both countries seem to be dominating the dialogue.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam Weinstein. It is indeed a very difficult geopolitical and economic scenario across the globe right now. It requires both Washington and China to ramp up productive approaches, to ramp up cooperation instead of pushing antagonistic rhetoric. And it is indeed a clarion call, particularly on all the permanent members of the UN Security Council, to push for peace, harmony, and connectivity rather than stoking divisions and fueling conflicts. That's it from us at Matrix Mag. Thank you again, and we'll be with you for another episode very soon.